as soon as you put it online, it's out there at the end of the day. You've given that digital asset to another computer or another organization. And
in today's podcast of Data for All, data privacy and the future of data. Welcome to the Data for All podcast. I'm Charlie Hyoun.
And I'm Charlie Apikian.
And we want to empower you to think different with data. And in today's podcast, we're with our guest,
Hyoun Park.
And we're going to talk about data privacy and the future of data. And so before we jump into the topics today, Hyoun, how about you tell us a little bit about yourself and your story with data?
Sure. So I'm Hyoun Park. I'm the founder and chief analyst at Amalgam Insights. We are an industry analyst firm, similar to a Gartner or a Forrester, in that we look at technology markets and then evaluate vendors, look at best practices, and help companies with selecting solutions. We do this across three main areas. One is technology expense management. Second one is business intelligence and data management. And then the third is around financial management solutions, such as accounting solutions, close solutions, and business planning solutions. I got into data in a roundabout way. In college, I studied chemistry and was a women's studies major. And actually, both of those had data aspects to them. On the chemistry side, as you can guess, doing computational chemistry, looking at the ways that molecules were developed and how to create certain types of reactions, obviously had mathematical and chemical and data-related components. But on the women's studies side, that was actually, for me, very much a social science based study where I did a lot of survey work. So that actually was more relevant from a data perspective, because that's where I got to crunch data and work with statistics to a greater extent. So ironically, the women's studies degree ended up being very STEM-like for me at the end of the day.
So you were in a position on that side as well, I imagine, where you were generating your own data.
Yes. Definitely. And it was interesting to be able to see what was happening in the world and then to be able to translate that into results, into analytics, and figure out what was going on there. But to be honest, I didn't really get into data and analytics until I started using those tools I learned in college for a much more important endeavor, which was fantasy baseball, where I started crunching numbers and building these predictive models based on 3 years of performance data and figuring out where players were going to be. And frankly, I used that to play in a variety of leagues and make some money that way. And this was before Moneyball came out and before ESPN and Yahoo really had their own forecasts.
So were you just taking the backs of baseball cards and recording the manual data or the data manually? A
little bit more than that. There's a database that you could download that had basically all of the player information from about 1870 to today. And you could look at that number, those numbers, figure out where were people's home parks, their weight, their height, their age, along with all of the recorded stats that they had. And from that, you could do some decent analysis, and it was enough to be able to have a competitive advantage if you knew how to crunch the numbers.
That's cool. And so at that point in time, were you using just a spreadsheet to track it all, or did you have some other tool sets that you were using?
So I was using a combination of spreadsheets and SPSS, which was a predictive analytics solution I learned way back when.
SPSS, is that the software that, like, I worked in a psychology lab, and we used a piece of software to do differential equation or standard deviations, and I want to say it was SPSS. Is that the same thing or no?
Well, it could have been SPSS. It could be in SAS, SAS. If you're just crunching numbers, could have been something like MATLAB. You know, those were the things we learned back in school. I want to say like 20 years ago. Nowadays, you just use R and Python for everything. But once upon a time, we all had to use these proprietary corporate software solutions.
That is true for the most part. I did have one professor that was a baller when it came to stats, and he would just run his own equations in Excel and just be done with it, which is fancy but difficult.
Yeah, because you have to actually know how to do everything from scratch to do it that way.
He was. We'll call him an analytical mind for sure. So that's cool. Like, you want a little bit of money, like wet your chops in like creative uses of data and things like that. And so from that point, how did you get to where you're at now, where you're teaching executives about the importance of data, and then I assume also using said data in the analysis of multiple different, industry groups?
Yeah. So it ended up that was for me a starting point to look at data in other areas of my life as well. So at the same time I was doing the fantasy baseball thing, I had a day job, which was basically working at a phone company as a rep, literally the guy who was answering the phone and, said, "Oh, is your phone service up? You want caller ID with that?" And from that, I noticed that we had this system that we put our data into, which was called CRM, customer relationships, management.
I'm familiar with those.
Sure. And learning, okay, so every time we put data in, it goes into the back end. So what is that back end? And then I learned that back end was a relational database. And so I started learning about the administration of that and figured out, this thing is called a database, and it is dependent on things called, some sort of data structure. And here's how data is ACID, and here's how data is consistent over time, and here's how you manage it. So I started learning how databases worked. And then separately, I started doing more and more survey work over time. And before you knew it, all of a sudden I'm doing business intelligence and data stuff where I really had never thought that I was going to be doing that. But I got in just through the things that I was interested in or that I had to do professionally to, just to pay the bills.
That makes sense. So real quick question. Do you find, because I feel like from my perspective, because I've known you for a while, just so everybody here knows, I met you in an industry association meeting and we've kept a relationship since then and whatnot. But I've always found what you do to be like the data's out there on how things are, and you're the stacker up of the data, and then does this data match that data? Is this industry doing as well as that industry, and what are the differentiators and stuff? And I've always appreciated the work, but do you find any correlations in like your approach or interest between what you do now and the original baseball venture?
I find it interesting in that in some ways I'm still looking at performance, but I'm now looking at the performance of companies instead of the performance of individual players. It's a little more difficult because companies and business don't have the same sets of rules that exist in baseball. Baseball is a game. It has a very specific set of rules. It is played on a field. All these things that make it very constrained from a data collection perspective. Whereas in business, other than the fact that companies make money, they do it in so many different ways that it's not enough to just look at a business from a technical perspective or from an operational perspective or from a compliance perspective or from a legal perspective. When you're trying to figure out which companies are better than others or which ones are better risks or worse risks in terms of being able to implement their solutions going forward. And frankly, it's not enough for them to, sometimes it's not enough for a company to just have the best technology, because if you have good technology, but your sales are not good, then the company's not going to survive. And and you have to take things like that into consideration. And then you also have to deal with all these people coming up to you as you're making these recommendations, and they will politically kind of lobby for their own solution in their own different ways, which is also something that baseball players never did for me when I was selecting my fantasy baseball team.
Fair enough. Fair enough. That's definitely a conversation all on its own. But I get baseball's a lot of hard stats. Mm-hmm. But then if you were really like going for a specific team and not fantasy stuff, you'd have to consider that non-quantifiable team cohesion and things like that, which you do have to do on the enterprise side of things or on the business side of things. But also one of the things that I found to be the most disturbing was that financial data wasn't a 1 or a 0. It's very subject to interpretation and change as well, depending on what you use as capital expenses versus operational expenses. It was very disheartening to me because I thought you could just put it in, it's financial data. It's actual numbers. You can put that in a spreadsheet and go with it. And it's not at all how it works.
Yeah, it's funny. When I got my MBA, I thought that I'd be having a very academic exercise of learning what businesses were like. And what I ended up learning was mostly that if you create a corporate structure, then you can put all your liabilities onto that corporate structure and avoid personal responsibility, something that a lot of CEOs seem to have embraced in this day and age. But also that there's a lot of ways to look at the business that could give you different types of results. As you mentioned, talking about assets and depreciation and whether you can depreciate something all at once or whether you do it over 5 years or 10 years or whatever it is. As wonky as it sounds from the outside, it makes big difference on what you can say are your profits or what's realized, and it makes the difference for your stock price or what have you. And all these things, a lot of them can be based on opinion rather than really hard facts, because some of these hard facts aren't really so hard in business. Mm-hmm.
That's like I said, that very disturbing to me, but I imagine that makes for some very creative ways to look at stuff from your perspective too. Right.
And although I advocate for people to take a straightforward approach to representing their data, they always have choices on what they can do.
Well, that can act as a good segue into the actual topic that I wanted to talk about today, because the representation of data is interpretive right now if you have all the data and whatnot. And so what I want to talk about is the current state of data privacy and ownership. And, as we mentioned, or as we've mentioned on previous podcasts, there are entities that exist that are looking to improve that. The European Union has GDPR. In California, we've got CCPA, right?
Right.
And so those are protection, it's protection legislature that's geared towards a certain goal. But I feel like it's a very immediate goal rather than the long-term goal, which we'll get to in a little bit when we start talking about the future. But what's your opinion on the current state of privacy and ownership when it comes to how we interact with our technology and other folks and whatnot?
Yeah. So over the past couple of decades, I think that data privacy has really become weakened over time. We have created gigantic companies such as Alphabet, Google, as well as Meta, Facebook, that have really made it their business to collect other people's information and to do that as effectively as possible and often without any sort of governance, any sort of legislation, any sort of legal rules, because they were moving faster than the government could act.
Absolutely.
So, I think, for instance, when Facebook started creating its networks of data to be able to collect information from other websites, it was both brilliant from a business perspective in terms of being able to make more money and a real challenge for data privacy going forward, because all of a sudden, all of your web activity is something that Facebook has direct access to if you ever log into Facebook.
Yeah. And it's valuable.
Right.
They turned it into value.
It's quite valuable. And then you add to that what has happened with the mobile phone, where basically so much of our activity happens through the mobile phone. It is not uncommon for people to use their phone 4, 6, 8 hours a day for everything from calls to business stuff to games to watching movies or TV or what have you. You know, it all happens on that phone, and the phone knows what is happening to it. And often each app that you're using on that phone has its own rules for whether they are sharing your data with one or more other organizations. From a practical perspective, it's basically inviting a wiretap from each app that you download on your phone.
Oh, yeah.
And you are just giving those permissions to each company. It is something that we would have thought was unconscionable when we were kids. You know, 30, 40 years ago, we all worried about wiretaps and our information being taken by the government or other organizations or being tracked. And now we just accept it as part of our day-to-day life. We take it for granted. Every time we click on permissions given to each app, we basically are saying, yes, you can track my behavior as much as you want, because I either trust you or I want to watch this TV show so much that I just don't care what Netflix is collecting from me.
I think the majority of at least the folks that I know are in the latter category. It's just like, I just don't care enough. I mean, I'm not going to sit here and say that I read EULAs by any means, but I know how to mess with my permissions. And I use iOS, and since I was 14, you've got a lot of options as far as what they do and don't see. But I'm still trusting Apple with the data, because Facebook might not have it. Well, Facebook doesn't have it anyways, because I don't have the app on my phone, and I use a specific browser to log into just Facebook that doesn't get anything else.
Like using a DuckDuckGo or something like that.
Yeah, well, I just stick with Firefox
or Tor. Yeah,
well, Tor's really good. Now, like I'll allow session cookies, but it's the more permanent cookies that I'm huge into. And we did cover that and some of the permission things. We talked about always on microphone and how this year is realistically the first year you can do always on camera, and not have your battery die in a single day. And so if we're to your point earlier, like the government can't keep up, or protection groups can't keep up. Right. And so if always on camera becomes a thing, like that, we would be ignorant to think that it wouldn't be used. Specifically by companies that require more information to reach their growth model, or their revenue projections and things like that. But then there's also other companies that may be using it for other purposes and whatnot. And so if they can capture it or can use it, then I'm sure they will. So as far as like, I like the point that you were just making a little bit ago, as far as like the way the privacy works. And I feel like that's a fitting analogy, because everybody knows what a wiretap is. And to be tapped back in the day, and I guess still it's this way. No, because they can do warrantless wiretaps now. Forgot about that. But you used to have to go get a warrant, and then they would come out and physically install something on a phone, and then they would listen to every word you say. But from the way you're putting it, everybody's listening to everything you say, or everybody has the potential to listen to what you say now, because it is in fact being captured. Right.
At least, certain apps, any app that you speak to basically is collecting your collecting what you say. And they're doing it probably to help their own speech recognition models, or to get an idea of your sentiment, how happy or sad or angry or whatever you are while you are watching that app or playing that app or what have you. So all of that is definitely a challenge from a data privacy perspective. And I think that the issue with data privacy there is that as we are dealing with these challenges, we obviously don't want that data to be used against us. So, so there's this right in GDPR, for instance, that right to be forgotten.
Well,
comes up.
Let's actually just jump into that. So,
Sure.
as far as current protections go, me as a resident of Tennessee, my options are very limited. And then but if I'm in California, I've got more protections. But then if I'm in Europe, or in the European Union, I've got GDPR. And so GDPR's, you're saying it's got the right to be forgotten built into it. But can you do like a quick overview of what GDPR is?
Sure. GDPR is basically general data protections regulations saying that each individual in the European Union has the right to manage their own information, and that it can be forgotten or kept based on the user's preference. And that's actually a real challenge because, so going back to baseball for a second, when I looked at baseball data, nobody ever deleted any of the baseball data. Once you hit a home run or whatever, that home run is held out in history forever. The player can't just say, I'm not going to have that home run count. You don't remove data like that. With GDPR, each user needs to be able to remove their data from your corporate information, and that's regardless of where the company is. So, for instance, even if you, Charlie Yielding, are running a company in Tennessee, if you have clients in Europe, each one of those clients in Europe can say, based on their preference, we're not working with you anymore. Please delete all of our information from your data. And then you have to figure out how to do that. And although that from a privacy perspective, I think that's a good idea. From a technical perspective, that's really challenging because we create data systems to store data and keep that data secure and independent. We don't create that data so that we can delete little bits of it that are often intertwined with all these other data sets. So that can be a real challenge to just simply to set up and tend to align each bit of data to a specific user.
Yeah, I do remember when GDPR went into effect, the industry association that we're both a part of, it was the big topic for one of the shows, and it's how do we set up the processes? How do we make sure that when the request comes through that somebody's there to see it and all of that kind of stuff? Because the way it works is a user or a person in Europe can just say, "Hey, company A that's collecting my data, get it out of there.
Right.
I want it gone." And so are they allowed to anonymize it, or do they have to delete every single shred of it as a default?
So in theory, they have to delete. And so that ends up being really challenging. From a practical perspective, GDPR is really built to go after the big companies so that they can fine Facebook or Google €1 billion or whatever when they do something that's egregious. But they can't just set a rule that says this is really just for Meta and Alphabet and everybody else doesn't have to follow it, because that's just not how laws work.
Yeah, we're not going to be suing your pants off, just these guys.
Yes, but from a practical perspective, it means that every other company that does business in the European Union has to at least think about it, because it is at least a potential concern that exists. So now all of the rest of us with European clients now have to think about, how do we keep track of our European clients? Do we have to do this separately from the rest of our clients at this point? How do we make sure that that data is findable? And then also from a GDPR perspective, they have this concept of the chief data privacy officer that has to be in charge of managing this data and making sure that you can actually that person is actually held responsible for the data privacy issues that come into play.
That sounds like a positive thing, even though it's forcing cost in a situation where companies may not be ready to spend it. But it feels like from a future forward perspective that's a good move.
I think it can be. My concern with the data privacy officer position is whether that person is responsible for enough of the business to be relevant. Because if you were making some random IT security manager your chief data protection officer, like that is not a good way to go. This should be somebody who is relatively high up, whether it's your CISO, your chief security officer, your CFO, or somebody who really has skin in the game in managing the business and has the capabilities to work with the rest of the business in coordinating what is necessary to support data privacy issues.
Yeah, I feel like that's the same position that a lot of CIOs found themselves in 15 to 20 years ago, where that we're trying our best to get stuff stood up, but we were really just in the position to absorb this, and we sit right behind the CFO, and we don't make our own decisions and whatnot. But nowadays, that's definitely changing. CIOs get a lot; they have a seat at the table, so to speak.
Yeah, and I've always found that I find this concept of C-level officers who report to other C-level officers a little confusing, because either you are the chief, reporting to the CEO, or you are actually a couple layers down. Like, what are you chief of? If you're the chief reporting to the chief, it's like, what's going on here?
You're the chief of something until it comes to spending money. In which case, you're no longer the chief.
Right.
But I'm glad things are changing. So do you feel like not to dig too deep into the GDPR stuff, but this is very interesting to me. Do you feel that is the current state of the chief data privacy officer?
Yeah, I feel like that role is currently kind of in flux. Businesses aren't quite sure how important of a person to put in that role, and part of it is dependent on how much they think their companies are actually are going to be affected by GDPR. For instance, if you're call it a 50-person company, nobody's probably going to come after you for GDPR unless you do something egregiously awful. So, for you that for that kind of company, you might have somebody in the middle because it just doesn't matter all that much. But at the same time, I think it's promising. I think there should be some sort of rule going along with that thing that that data privacy officer should be higher up, somebody responsible for business, somebody who's actually spending money, not just okaying stuff at a mid-level.
Yeah. That's like talking about 50 some odd companies and stuff like that. So where we work, the COO just takes care of that role as well. And so she's constantly digging into some very, very fine details on what to do and not to do with data. Because every company we work with has got a big old survey they send over that we've got to take care of and stuff. And so data protection is definitely on everybody's minds these days, but it's not always how to protect the consumer. And so back to GDPR, other than the right to be forgotten, are there any other kind of high level GDPR accomplishes this for Europeans?
I think that's really the main one, but it's important and challenging enough that from a data perspective, it is a fundamental shift, especially for companies that pull information from other companies. So going back to Facebook Meta, which may pull information from hundreds of other websites. All of a sudden, you have to coordinate. We're not just forgetting you on your main account, but we are forgetting you in our vast web of information, vast web of websites where we have looked at your data, or looked at your IP address, looked at your whatever activities might be associated with your direct Facebook account in the first place. There's a whole lot of complexity there that needs to be managed, and it's not easy to do based on the way that we think of data as something that is we typically think of data as something that needs to be kept secure, not something that needs to be erasable at any moment.
Yeah, that makes sense. And so we talked in a previous podcast as well about the profile that's built for you and stuff like that. And so that's what you're getting at when you say they've got your direct Facebook information, your usage from other websites, and any other information that they're able to bring in about you. They put that to an anonymous profile that's then advertised to. And would that still count under the GDPR umbrella or no?
Right. And anything that makes you personally identifiable, because, for instance, phones can track your location down to, in some cases, feet or inches if the technology is there, and the latitude and longitude. Metrics go down to 0.000001 degrees or whatever it is. So if you've got that kind of location information, or you've got a unique IP address that you've been using because you're based in a certain location or a certain computer or certain device or whatnot, anything linked to those also counts as being personally identifiable.
Okay, so that's good. So one of the examples I gave about because other Charlie, he's other Charlie in this case because he's not here and he can't defend himself. So other Charlie's definitely worked with healthcare data, and he's talked about like if there's only one or two people in a zip code, you can't use that because it's too identifiable. And then I put I talked specifically about how the location of phones, like you sleep somewhere, and if you can derive basically like your address just off of your sleep schedule that your phone is already capturing.
Right. Like for me, my full first name is Hyoun, Hyoun,
Okay.
And sure, if you list my first, for most people, you might say if you just have a first name, that's not necessarily identifiable. But for me, obviously, like in the United States, like there are very few towns I can go to where I won't be the only one.
That's fair.
Or only one of a few with that name. So, in like my current town, is a current town of 20,000 people. I'm almost certainly the only person with my first name.
I'd put a bet on that.
Yeah. And so if it's that level of, so that would also count as being personally identifiable. It's not like just having a name like John or Jane, where it is possible that you would not be able to identify someone just by that.
Yeah. I get some of that because there's not that many Charlie Yieldings out there. And so it's like normally when I'm Googling something or myself, like I come up and just me until it gets down into people that don't share the last names and whatnot. So it would be easy to find, like you said, those unique names, but then even if you've got like a standard, an overused name or however you call it, I don't even know how you say that, but you're still findable. You're still identifiable in a lot of ways. And so to contrast, because we've talked about GDPR, and in the United States, specifically in California, there's a similar bit of legislation called the CCPA, which is the California Consumer Protections Act.
Right.
And so how does that differ, and does it also have the right to be forgotten?
Well, the biggest thing about CCPA is that it is created because, frankly, the United States has not taken a stand as a national organization. Yet, when you look at other companies in California, like Apple, that do want to take a strong privacy stand, they wanted to have some sort of legislation in place to be able to point to, to be able to protect user needs, and also because there's a lot of techies in California who advocated for this as well.
I bet, yeah,
sure.
I would say that from a California, or from the perspective of California, that the most tech literate folks in the nation live there and have for the past couple of decades. I mean, some of that's changing, like there's some migrations going on, but the quality of tech conversation you can have like in the Bay Area is definitely, I would call it superior or more advanced than
I would say it's more common. Okay. You've got smart tech people everywhere at this point, but I would say that in California, you have it's more likely that you'll talk about tech in the coffee shop or just in your regular day-to-day life. It comes up more often because tech is a big industry, obviously.
That makes sense.
So I think that the California likes pushing rules, I would say, that they think are right for them and trying to, it's California's way of pushing states' rights, I would say, putting in rules in place before the rest of the U.S. and trying to take a stand on saying, this is how we think things should be.
Yeah. So, I mean, and I think in this case, it makes sense because we as a country do have to have some sort of conversation about what we will and won't allow and what our rights as consumers are. We'll get into that in just a little bit. But as far as like the CCPA, like what protections does it offer for Californians?
So it is, I would say, a similar type of legislation. Where the goal is to protect specifically Californians from the ability to have their data used without their consent. But the hard part there is just that California rules versus federal rules are obviously different.
Like they're going to have a fight to set the precedent, right?
Right. And that's kind of happening right now where the Biden administration is trying to start putting in rules for nationwide or federal standards around data. And California's saying, wait a second, we already have our rules and we don't want you to get into our mess with the rules that we've already put into place. So we think we are ahead of the federal government. We want to do things our way. And, honestly, we have 49 other states that are probably going to take similar stances one way or another. So what we're getting into what I think is going to be a very interesting fight in the United States around what data privacy actually is, what our rights are as individuals versus our rights as companies to collect information. What is going to be cost efficient? What is going to be compliant? All of these things are going to come up probably at the state level because right now we are a country that really, is very split in a bunch of ways, and I think this is not going to be an exception.
I would 100% agree with you. The only thing, we can get into that a little bit more in just a little bit, but like back to the CCPA versus like what the Biden administration is pushing through. Do you have an opinion on what should happen from this point? So would it be easy for the federal government to adopt that, or is that the point that you were just making where that's not going to happen and each state's just going to have to figure it out? Like that is the end goal, or is that the preferred end goal, or would it be preferred to have like some sort of federal protection?
I think that from a practical perspective, there should be some sort of federal standard because it just makes it easier for everybody to have a starting point when something's there. And for the most part, people agree that they should have some rights to protect their own data other than having to scroll through, as we were talking about before, those 3,000 word end user license agreements that exist for every single thing. You don't read them. I don't read them. Nobody reads them. But it doesn't mean we actually agree with those agreements. It just means that it is too painful to figure out what this means and to spend an hour to figure out if I want to play Candy Crush Saga or not.
No, I do know exactly what you mean because there are games. It's like, why would the game need access to my microphone? They don't at all. Right. I mean, they do, but that's because they're generating revenue through other ways. And so we talk a lot about personal choice and making those decisions based off of what you feel is right or wrong. And so that's why, like, to this point, I have not created a TikTok account or downloaded the app or anything like that because I don't agree with how they're using and collecting information, and to the degree at which they're collecting it. And the same thing with Facebook. Like, I don't have the app on my phone. I keep them away from me because Facebook has specifically proven that they will use your data in ways that, like, they've literally done experiments on people without their consent before. And that's too much of a breach of trust for me to engage with them in that way.
I feel like that's something that's true of all big tech, really, that they are used to saying, we have 100 million users or 1 billion users. We're just going to do experiments on that because we can, and because it is unlikely that anybody is going to do anything about it.
Well, you could say experiments, but you could always also say market research. And then sometimes those are the same thing. It's like if your goal is to get more clicks, for instance, then you're going to change up the way things work, but you're literally going into the realm of changing behavior, which is an experiment that's normally controlled, and you've got to consent to it and all of that kind of stuff. And so I would like to see some stuff in that avenue as far as like understandable uses of data, but back to my original point, knowing where we are right now, I just don't engage with that because I don't want them to have my data forever.
Yeah, the best way to protect your data is not to give it out in the first place.
Which is it's a proactive, conscious choice. If you want to draw anywhere the line, if you want to draw the line in the sand anywhere, you've got to know that there's sand there to begin with,
right?
And that an option right now is like it's not as black and white as it used to be, but it's like I will or I won't. And there's no middle ground. iOS 14 had options to limit or reduce the amount of access that apps required to be able to use them. And so that's helped out some. But again, to make the point I did earlier, you're still trusting Apple with all that information as well.
Right. And now that Apple's starting to get into ads and their own credit card and all these other things that are get deeper into your behavior, you start having to wonder how much you can trust Apple, even though I think Apple overall has been pretty good with their data protection policies to this point.
So I would agree with that. And that's why I do use the Apple ecosystem. I also trust Google, but they're starting to get in trouble in areas where they're not being strictly regulated as well. But the thing is with Apple is just, you don't know, because they keep it under lock and key, but do they use it for anything? We'll see.
Right.
I mean, I'm sure they do, obviously, but it's like, to what extent, like, we don't know.
Yes. But even with companies that you might trust, like Apple, I still think the better part of valor is discretion, and in that you don't put information online with any platform that you don't want the world to know.
That is a really good way to put it, because the understanding of what data is a bit ambiguous from a general population perspective. And because I've talked to people before that don't really think about how the data that they're currently generating will be around when they're in their 70s and 80s, and however long they live. Because there's people that say if you live to 2050, then you'll live 150 years and all this other kind of stuff. But for the rest of your natural born life and then on, the data that we're capturing is going to persist, and so there will be a lifetime's worth of data for like the younger generation now. And the way we put it here before is like our generation is 1 foot in, 1 foot out. So we get to grow up without it to a certain extent. But then at one point we started engaging with our own data collection through one means or another. And so it's going to persist. And so knowing all of that, like, how do we transition into the future of data, knowing that Korea. Oh, you know what? Actually, so there was one piece I wanted to talk about too, because we've got GDPR and CCPA, but then in South Korea, they've got, and I've got to read this so I don't get it wrong. It's the Personal Information Protection Commission, or PIPC, that just recently fined Google and Meta for unauthorized data collection in that country. And so that's another option for protection. Do you have any opinions on the panels versus the laws and how they're enforced or anything like that?
I think that the panels and the laws are doing something similar. So South Korea is interesting in that they have, I would say, a very close relationship with the largest corporations that exist there, such as Samsung, especially on the tech side, and the government. And it's probably telling, I would say, that they would have fined Google and Meta and not Samsung when all three, honestly, are doing a lot of data collection. I would kind of politically say that there's probably something going on there that is not simply about data.
Okay. So what you're saying is panels are potentially influenceable just like people.
Oh, absolutely.
Okay.
South Korea has its own way of doing politics. It's a little bit different than the United States. Well, depends on what you think of politicians.
True. They've got their own culture in a lot of different ways too, because I know their work culture is very hardworking group of folks. However you put that.
Yeah,
that's the norm.
Yeah, it definitely is. On the work side, you have a lot of people who are, it's definitely a different culture than the U.S. in that you have people who have agreed to a certain set of behaviors, but then there's also a social contract that exists to a greater extent. Like there's this expectation that companies will have a responsibility to treat your data a certain way. For instance, they are supposed to do certain things for you. It's this two-way street. Mm-hmm.
Okay. I like the idea of the two-way street, the two-way street part of it, because now we can get into the future aspects of it, of data and data collection and living on and stuff like that. Because I feel like the right to be forgotten is great, except for the fact that you're deleting data, and that hurts me in my soul to hear about people just getting rid of swaths of information that could be beneficial for one reason or another in the future. But, it could be detrimental if you've, to the point you made earlier, if you put something up that you don't like and you don't want anybody to ever see, the right to be forgotten would be really helpful from that perspective. But supposing that it's been out on the internet, like if you posted it and somebody saw it, it's safe to assume that somebody's got it somewhere and you're never going to be truly rid of it.
Right. As soon as you put something online, as soon as you put it outside of your particular computer or device, it's out there at the end of the day. You've given that digital asset to another computer or another organization, and your control over it is limited, and all you've got going for you is whatever legislation or laws are there, and then the organization's willingness to follow those laws. But there's nothing physically that you can do to prevent a lot of this from being shared. And I think that is increasingly an issue because we are all digital creators to some extent. We're creating a digital asset right now with this podcast, and that can be used any number of ways. Of course, there's intellectual property restrictions that will protect the use of this in theory, but it's also part of the digital history that will be out there going forward. And I think that's a real challenge for managing data and for understanding where data is, how data is used going forward. So when I think of what I mean by that is, so data is the foundation for everything we do from an analytical perspective, from a machine learning perspective, artificial intelligence perspective. When we look at trying to make some sort of prediction, we do that off of all the data that exists in the past that is related to that prediction that we are trying to make. But we don't necessarily know who owned that data or who created that data. We just have that kind of end result of the prediction or the machine learning or whatever that output is. And I think that is going to be increasingly difficult to manage between knowing which data was being used in the first place, which data was used and then deleted, which data, that data lineage story gets messier and messier to understand over time, especially as information can increasingly be deleted or not deleted.
Yeah, I hadn't thought about that part of it, but our picture of the world, because we did talk about AI and machine learning in a previous podcast, just to kind of set the foundation of this exists. They're kind of one and the same. There's a little bit of difference and all that kind of stuff. And so that is true. And so if you're using a predictive model to accomplish something, and then data can be deleted inside of that, like I know of several like business use cases where that would be impactful and potentially skew data. But also I don't know if it would be enough, if enough people would say like, get it out of here or whatnot.
Right.
To be that impactful. But I guess in the future, which is, where we're going, like that could be somebody's, how people jump on and off of social media now. It's like they're on for a year and then they'll get pissed and they'll be gone for a few months and they come back. Like each time that happens in the future, somebody could just be like, I'm shutting it down and I'm deleting everything.
Right.
And then that's that. I could see that being more common if it's a part of the process of quitting something in the future. But so where do you see, like, given the fact that it could interrupt or it could be impactful on that side of things, like where do you see the need or the potential for personal privacy and data ownership like where do you think it needs to go to be more comprehensive?
So in theory, we should have rights to all of our data. I am firmly on that side, but I think from a practical perspective, it's hard to know what data we've even created. Like every time you visit a website, there's a cookie, or every time you do some sort of digital transaction, your credit card company has all this additional metadata associated with that transaction that you may not even know about. And in theory, all of that is your data. But at this point, the ability for us to even track our own data is starting to be overwhelming. Prohibitively overwhelming. So that is our kind of big cultural challenge, trying to figure out what can we actually manage of our own data now that there is so much out there that we don't have control over. I do think that is a starting point. We should have full access to all of our financial data and all of the account data associated with all the accounts that we have across everything.
That does seem like a good starting point, because that's also something you could. So the way I see it is, and I 100% agree with you, is that we do need more access and rights when it comes to our data. Because if I create it, I want to own it. And I just think about all of that metadata that, to your point, I've never even considered. Like, it knows how long I looked at certain images, and it's on that granular of a level. And so what would I even do with it if I put it in, if I collected it somehow? And so we'll need for sure some way to ingest that data. And that, there are plenty of there are plenty of practical uses for massive amounts of data right now, but that exists in a Google. Like in the world of Google, or in the like any kind of like auto the assistants and stuff like that. Like you can ask them questions, and through machine learning, they've come to know this, they've come to know that. And I feel like on a personal level, there's going to be like something similar, because we will do the work to figure out all the stuff that we build up, because I feel like we'll have to at some point. And it may not be in our generation, but in future generations, when our data is opened up and it's all eventually tied back to us, then they'll at least have a better picture of like, dang, these guys were under the microscope the entire time. Do we need that level of visibility going forward just for advertising?
Right.
And so we'll have to answer those questions, and I hope I'm around for it for sure. But there's a long way to go.
I mean, the irony is that to create a personal data profile, you'll have to give something access to all of your personal data to be able to aggregate that in the first place. And then I guess that profile becomes the next privacy issue.
it all comes down to the, like, if you're storing it in the cloud, it's always at risk. And even if you're storing it locally, like, is it going to be commonplace for us to all have petabytes worth of data storage in our house locally? Like we've got, we're talking about battery walls and things like that. Like, would we get to the point to where we'd have that, so I could have like local drives at home where I just store all my stuff, but then I would still be using a piece of software to access that and then give me the information I need, because I won't have that kind of computing power in my home unless what are the computers that use light and they can be open and closed?
Optical.
Yeah, it is optical, but they got a fancy name for them, right?
Can't think of it offhand.
Anyways, like the optical computers, like those are going to be like supercomputers in everybody's home. So maybe then, but right now we'd realistically, like, that could be the only thing. It's like, I choose this one company to trust, and then we go from there. But then, do you feel like between not owning anything and then owning everything, is there a happy place where we both can share the wealth, so to speak? Like, I just have access to my data and can do what I want with it, but then they also keep it in their own secure ways, so long as I'm cool with it.
I guess we can always opt in to having other companies use our data. But I think the reality is, for us to have control of our data, companies have to give up their access to our data, or at least be able to volunteer to give up access to our data. And yes, it will make their models worse, and it will make then they will have lesser ability to monetize that activity. And frankly, maybe that's a good thing for society, if companies can't make as predictive a model based on knowing every detail of our lives, because data is getting created so quickly right now, and we always think about how much more data exists and how predictive it can be. But maybe there should be more of a discussion of how to delete data and reduce the amount of data associated with each person as well at the end of the day. Not because it's the best for each particular business. This may not be the best for MasterCard and Visa and Meta and Google, but it would be better for us as human beings to be able to protect our own data.
Yeah, I definitely 100% agree with that. The thing from my perspective, like, I feel like that the way that IT in business and, at these big companies works is that it's so split up. Like, you can think like big tech, like Meta and Google and stuff like that. And they're definitely building in the cloud now. But a lot of industries are still running off of legacy systems. And then, so you've got one application from 2001 that lives on-prem somewhere that's feeding like really, really old sets of data into a database that then you're manually pulling because you can't connect the apps together and things like that. And so we're in a mess right now. But if we get to a point to where, like, we all agree, like, this is how you build these companies from the ground up from a data perspective, it feels like it would be accomplishable after that. Like, to get to a point to where, like, if it's in the architecture, or if deleting an individual is in the architecture from the start, it feels like that's just going to be much more accessible. And if you put together a company after GDPR, or in this case, like, you're starting from scratch with this process already built in, so it seems like it would be more efficient, more consistent.
Right.
And
if you start from scratch, it's honestly trivial to align each piece of data to that is associated with the user, and make sure that you track that going forward. Yeah, it's a lot easier if anytime you're building something from scratch. And the problem is always that you've got 50 years of legacy going back to whenever you built that first application or you got that first mainframe.
It really does go back that far. And so, like, especially in telecom, like they've been keeping up with numbers and data for a long time now, albeit like a lot less when it comes to like diversity of data, but they still get a lot of it.
Right. But as we know, like those telco companies, those, the AT&Ts and Verizons of the world, when you look behind the covers at their, operations and billing systems, a lot of the stuff they're using is still 30, 40 years old. And they're just using it because it worked before and they built these computers to be massive at the time, and they can still do the job kinda. So
and if they can't, then somebody in the channel can. So.
Right. Mm-hmm.
And so it's they're making it along, but eventually they're going to have to change. Like there's going to be a wave of out with the old, in with the new. Otherwise, you won't be able to keep up.
Right.
And so I'm waiting for that, like ready to strike. And once we start making those updates, well, I mean, I guess we've already started talking about it because, like on here, we're talking about that. This is going to go out to people, hopefully, and then they're going to hear and they're going to be like, okay, so. This is definitely something to consider, because I like to think about it as far like for the future, at least, it's like there'll be data archaeology, and that's a silly way to put it, but it's true. Like there will be the opportunity for curious people in the future. If you think about like you tracking your family tree or whatnot, like that's going to be, first of all, it's way easier up to or down to like 99 or so, and then you get back into antiquated ways of doing it and whatnot, but there will be people that can say on a scale of 0 to 100%, how truthful was this individual over the course of their life? Because they'll be able to say, these are the commitments, or these are the commitments, these are the things it made, because we take pictures that you can associate with things. We have phone calls, we have text messages, and they're starting to use those new methods, if you'll call it, of data analyzation in like there's a thing going on with the government right now where they're definitely putting effort into figuring out how all of that ties together to build a picture, and that's going to be everybody's situation in the future. And so this is slightly cheeky, but in the future we're going to have to be a lot more tolerant as a society goes, because everybody's junk's going to be on the internet. Like that's just the way it's going to work, unless you can convince your 16-year-old or your 17-year-old or your legally old enough year-old to not send dirty pictures on the internet. It's going to come back. And there was a politician that recently got in trouble. It was on the younger side over some stuff that happened because they had a cell phone in their hand when they were 17, which is silly. And so we're just going to have to get over some of that. And then the other piece of it is just picking ourselves up to understand this thing enough to know like what's good and what's not.
Yeah, I think of what I did when I was 17, 18, 19, and I'm glad that was almost 30 years ago when we did not have cell phones.
It was before the wave.
To memorize, sure. to memorialize that digitally for everybody and everyone. But I think of data privacy as part of this bigger picture of data ownership. Like how much do we actually own our own data? From a historical perspective, for the future, how do we own all of that data that is associated with us at the end of the day? How much credit do we have? Are we able to trademark that data? Do we, if our data is used to create something else, honestly, should we own a piece of that? Like we are a part of every credit model that because obviously people make billions of dollars off of these credit models, and those credit models honestly come from our spending history.
That's actually a really good. That's a really good point.
Like all these companies making all this money off of models from our behavior, literally from the things that we do. And yet we don't get any piece of that. We just get tracked.
We get to feed into it more as they grow.
Yes.
That's an interesting concept. I'm gonna have to think about that one quite a bit, because it is true. Like we're the pack horse. Is that right? Is that a good analogy?
We are we are either you're the consumer or you're the product. Yeah. But I feel like we're being treated as the product when we're the creators. Like,
oh, that's a good point.
It's like,
So on that note, then, from a back to the present day perspective, what are do you have anything that you would recommend just to the public in general? Like, what are the best ways to think about or approach the data that you're creating day in and day out?
Yeah, I think it is really hard at this point to manage your data, but a few little things that I think would help are first to use when you're online, use a privacy-based browser, whether it be say a DuckDuckGo or something that is, or being able to use Firefox that is governed to be more protective of your identity, because there's so much information that we share that we are not aware of simply by clicking on standard websites. Every website is stocked full to the gills with 20, 30, 40 different apps that are all meant to collect your information in some way. And that is absolute bog standard in this day and age.
Bog standard. I like that one.
Second thing that I think about is simply what information do you put online and into which apps? I think that needs to be an active decision that is made. Right now, we are kind of trained to just put in all the information that we want. All the information that is asked for, we just fill in forms without even thinking about whether this is optional or required. Perhaps it's better to think a little bit more about not giving optional information if you don't need to, especially for organizations that you have little to no relationship with.
Right. Okay. So to take that down a step into like practical application. So you're going, like, we'll pick on Facebook, but we'll act like we don't have an account. So we go to Facebook, we go to sign up for account, the terms and conditions comes up, or the EULA, whichever one you want to call it. Do I read that?
So,
because that's what it's going to require.
It's not going to happen. I would of course recommend that people read those terms and conditions, or at least know what you're getting into. I know it's not going to happen in reality, but I think that at the very least, when Facebook asks, what is your name, what is your address, what is your phone number, what was your third pet when you were a child, what was your first car, you don't have to give it all the information that it asks for.
It doesn't have to be factually true.
Yes.
Okay. That makes sense.
Like whether you put your real birthday in or not. Yeah. Facebook cares whether you put in the right date or not, but frankly, who else, do they really need to know?
That's true.
Yeah.
There was a buddy of mine was listening to one of our previous podcasts, and he thought it was worth bringing up, and it's in line with this. It's like if you have like a Gmail account, and if you have an iCloud account, you can do it as well, but you can spoof emails. So if you do on the Google account specifically, if you do your email address and the plus sign, and then you can put in whatever tag you want in afterwards. Like say if you're on company A's website, you can put at plus sign company A at gmail.com or whatever. When you get the emails back, like meaning whoever they sell that information to or who's using it, then you'll know where it comes from, and so you can make better choices. But that's an after the fact kind of thing. Do you think that, like, I imagine, the internet is the internet, so there's probably somebody on YouTube that's already made like a 5-minute video of what the main highlights of the T's and C's are for, Facebook, for instance. So would you recommend checking that out? Like seeing if there's some way, actually I should probably Google it. If there is one, guys, I'll put that on in the notes, especially because there's always that one YouTuber that exists that does exactly what you need it to, or you need them to. And it's just on point. It's like, let's get to it. Now it's over. You're good. And I very much appreciate those YouTubers.
Yeah, and honestly, when I read through terms and conditions, mostly what it tends to say is that they have unlimited licensing rights to use whatever information you have. They they talk about their ability to whether you are going to go to a court in California or New York or whatever, if we have some sort of complaint, but more likely going to arbitration, just all these legal things that are honestly not very relevant to how we typically use social media. Like, when was the last time you actually thought about suing Facebook? Yeah.
It hasn't existed. It hasn't
It's
come
like,
up yet.
even if you wanted to, frankly, they've got 1,000 lawyers and they would bury you if you tried to sue them. It's like, so, from a practical perspective, all this is, so much of it is not relevant, but I think it's useful to read the parts around licensing just to know what they own. I think that's an interesting educational practice to do at least once for one of these big sites.
That makes sense. Like that's ultimately why I chose to stay away from TikTok, was because I went into what they were looking at and what they were capturing, and it was just not like they're looking at file names on my phone. They're looking at like everything they can, and app usage. They've got a biometric profile for your face. They've got a profile for your voice and all that kind of stuff too. And it's like, do you need all of that?
Well, their algorithm is fantastic at giving you exactly what you're looking for at that particular time. And that's why, because
That is true.
Because they are really good at taking all your information and figuring out what you're looking for. Yeah.
So we've talked previously about talking in the open air and then getting the ad for it and stuff. And so just the other day, we were in Marco Polo having a conversation about something, and the very first thing he pulled up in TikTok when he pulled it up was a TikTok related to that. So it was, you're not wrong. I mean, they're spot on with it, but it still seems like it's a lot though.
Yeah.
So thanks for coming by today. You're our first out of town guest for the podcast and whatnot. And
it's been a pleasure.
Yeah. And so before we wrap up and everything, I do want to give you the opportunity to talk about Amalgam Insights and your professional endeavors. And so if you want to tell everybody how to find you, where you are, and all that kind of stuff.
Sure. So my work is at amalgaminsights.com, which if I had thought about this earlier, I probably would have created a company name that's a little shorter, because that's a lot of letters to write out for a website, especially Amalgam, AMALGAM. Right now, we're working on 3 big research initiatives. One is around decision intelligence, the use of analytics to create actual outcomes and recommendations that people understand in natural language associated with the topics that they're trying to look up. Second one is around SaaS expense management, where people are trying to manage software as a service expenses right now, and your Salesforce, your Adobe, things like that, because the average company has between 300 and 1,000 apps currently being used, and that's a whole lot of contracts and invoices and costs to have to manage, and especially since the majority of them are outside of the CIO office right now. So it's a complete mess. And then the third is around business planning, where we're looking at how companies are dealing with their planning, budgeting, and forecasting, especially for things outside of traditional financial exercises such as workforce planning, supply chain planning, and how that's being done from a holistic business perspective. One of the good things about running an analyst firm is just being able to look at topics like this, what is really affecting companies right now, and then being able to dig into the vendors and the best practices associated with being able to manage them. That's what I do on a day-to-day basis, and and I'm sure we'll have additional research coming up as we keep going.
Well, I can definitely vouch for the fact that you know what you're about. I've always appreciated your insights into our section of the industry, which is MMS. How do you refer to our industry from the outside?
So I talk about it as technology lifecycle management.
Okay.
Obviously, telecom, mobility, that tends to cover telecom mobility, software, and cloud. I think there's a lot of lessons that the rest of IT can learn from how MMS and telecom expense management have evolved over the years. I think a lot of that gets ignored because everybody looking at SaaS and cloud thinks that they are like teenagers reinventing sex and drugs for the first time. It's like no, people have been doing this forever, doing this on a departmental basis, outsourcing stuff. It's like this stuff has been going on for 20 years and you think it's new just because you found out how to do it for the cloud.
Yeah. So like I said, I've always thought that your takes and your points that you're trying to make were always on point. And here, you've been talking about data consolidation for, a decade at least. Well, I mean, what year was it that we met?
Gosh, it
was in San Diego, I think.
I think it's been about a decade.
Oh, so about a decade ago, I saw you give your first presentation at the industry show. I thought it was extremely dense with intrinsic value, but then also just here is this thing that you should be paying attention to, and how it's going to go. And you've been right more often than not, which again I feel is
that's
fancy.
Always the goal.
It's definitely not something that anybody at Gartner or Forrester can attest to. So good job with that.
Oh, thanks.
And so just in case anybody wants to find you on the social medias or anything like that, like you're obviously on LinkedIn.
Yep. I'm on LinkedIn. I'm on Twitter at Hyoun Park, Hyoun Park. That's mostly where I've, between the website, LinkedIn, Twitter, like that's enough for me. I know there's a lot more out there, but gosh, like just keeping track of all the other social networks is honestly more than I have time for.
Yeah, that has to also be a choice as well. I will do this and I won't do that.
Right.
Otherwise,
I know there's TikTok and Instagram and everything else, but I just don't have the time for it.
That definitely makes sense. Well, and thanks again for stopping by. And until next time, podcast people.
All right.